Hello! Welcome to How to Succeed During a Pandemic. Hi, I'm Wendy Lally, your host, and I'm delighted that you could join us today. We have a very interesting show today. It's a little different than we normally do. We normally talk about business and things having to do with success, because that's the title of the show. But today we're going to talk about something a little more serious, and it's the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic that is taking lives, many lives. And people have to deal with the grief of that. And so on this show, we have two guests who both in the course of their business life are dealing with the grief of others. I personally have not been touched that way, thank God. I actually had COVID-19 myself. I've recovered, which is, thank you God. But unfortunately, not everyone in our country has been that fortunate, or in our community. And the two people who are with me today are people who are dealing very personally with that problem. The first is Rabbi Nancy Landsman, who is known professionally as the personal rabbi, because she not only has a congregation of Nancy, I told you I'm Miss Malaprop, Ahavat Olam, but she also ministers to people who don't normally attend services, and yet during a time like this may need someone, or their family may need someone. So we're going to talk to her today about those situations. And in the second half of the show, we're going to meet Marguerite O'Connor, who is the goodwill ambassador for Chicago Jewish Funerals. But I am delighted to welcome you, Rabbi Nancy, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're more than welcome. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you begin? How did you become a rabbi, and why did you become a rabbi?
It's a great question, especially for somebody who grew up in Mount Prospect, a very non-Jewish community, right? And growing up in a secular home as well, although we did belong to a Reformed congregation, B'nai Jehoshua Beth Elohim. And I was fortunate to go to a Jewish camp, Asrui, Olin saying, River Union Institute in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. How I got to this point was actually from my experiences at Congregation B'nai Jehoshua Beth Elohim. I always loved to sing, and I was in the junior choir and then the adult choir. And one thing led to another. I minored in music in college and majored in social work. And with the emphasis on gerontology, my own congregation hired me my senior year of college to be their cantorial soloist back in 1979, a few years ago. And I loved it. And that really was the start of my cantorial career, which extended beyond 30 years before things started to change. And God had another plan for me back in 2012. 10 people decided to start a new congregation, and they asked me to be their leader. At that point, I accepted their generous offer and was going to rabbinical school part-time, trying to figure out how am I going to make a living. 10 people can't support me, right? So I said, I'm going to go to rabbinical school, and I'm going to figure out how to serve those who need a rabbi or a cantor for any life cycle occasion, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, a funeral, baby naming, you name it. So that's exactly what happened. And so I've been ordained now since January of 2016, and it's been an amazing journey so far.
You know, I would imagine that this is a time when people feel they need religion more than ever before. Is that been your experience with what's happening?
That's a really great question. I would say that's true for some people. I think at the end of life, it's common when people know that they're dying, that somehow their spirituality comes to surface a little more than perhaps years before. Some people would call that being more religious or connecting to religion, but I have found that, especially those in my congregation, which is mainly people whose children have been formally trained with bar mitzvah and religious studies, they're now in their maybe 60s or 70s, and they've decided, you know, I miss being part of a community. So it's not maybe necessarily religion as it is a sense of community, which does entail services, right, for holidays and education. But I think it's more that communal desire we all have in common, the fact that we're Jewish and we come together for various occasions, including the holidays and such.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a special, I mean, I know there is a special culture about being Jewish that it seems to me isn't quite the same for the Christian community. There is an ethnic thing, you know, Irish Catholic or Italian, or but it isn't so much centered on the church. The church is like part of their ethnic culture background,
Mm-hmm.
whereas with Judaism, it's wherever you go and you meet a Jew, there is, you know, they're part of the tribe. And I've had that experience with my mother. We were traveling in Mexico and we're waiting in the rain. There was a rainstorm. We'd just gone to synagogue that night. It was a Friday service. And my mother thought this would be a good way to meet people. So, because my family is not particularly religious. And so we found a synagogue, we went to it, pouring rain when we come out. And we're just standing waiting for a cab, and my mother got into a conversation in Yiddish with someone who was standing there. It turned out that this woman, her parents grew up with my grandparents in Russia in a little town that was like, you know, Fiddler on the Roof. And they had settled in Mexico. My grandparents had settled in Philadelphia. And so, you know, we're meeting on this step of a synagogue in Mexico. It was just, how do you deal with that? Write a eulogy for someone who you've never met, and it's the last thing that anyone will say about them in their life.
Sure. Well, especially now during the pandemic, things are a little bit different.
Right.
But because I've been doing this work primarily for people I've never met, I've gotten pretty proficient at it. And I'm a good listener. I've been trained. I have a lot of education. And normally I would go into somebody's living room, meet with the family. Now we're doing this on Zoom or FaceTime, whatever is comfortable for the family. And I ask questions. I have people share whatever it is that's on their heart about their loved one. I ask them to paint a picture of this loved one so I can kind of get an idea of his or her life. I take great notes. And when we're all done, it's like, okay, trying to put all of this together as if I have an empty canvas like an artist, right? And create a beautiful eulogy. During my meeting, I often ask, do you have any pictures of her or him? You know, and they show me up to the camera, you know, on Zoom, and I see several pictures, and it's meant to be therapeutic for the family as well. And when it comes time to the funeral, many times we find today that family members want to speak about their loved ones. So I have them speak first when we get to the eulogy part of the service. And then I listen very carefully, and then I'm last, and I'll fill in whatever blanks are left, tell the story, because often people view it as a celebration of this person's life.
Because so much of our life has been affected. The whole thing of not being able to go to brunch with somebody. You know, yeah, you can go to brunch, but they sit at one side of the booth and you're at the other, and there's just not, it just ain't the same. Not being able to greet somebody with a hug. Those little things, but they mean so much to you as a human being.
For sure. And what surprises me during COVID is I've actually officiated at more weddings during COVID than I did the year before, which I think is kind of interesting. People really still want to get married, even if there's only 10 people allowed. Most of them have been outdoors. Next weekend, I'll be officiating a bat mitzvah inside a hotel, a large ballroom with 10 people. We're still going to wear masks. We're going to practice social distancing, and these are people that don't belong to a congregation. But for all of these occasions, they still want and need. Many times they prefer a rabbi to a cantor. When they learn I'm both, they're like, oh, and and so that's why I came up with the tagline, your personal rabbi, because I'm realizing, especially with the number of funerals that I have the honor to officiate, mainly for people I've never met, they still have needs, and it would not occur to them that they could request the person who is going to end up officiating their funeral to come and provide counseling to them, provide the comfort and the compassion that they are needing right now, as well as their family, right? And so actually a light bulb went off when a few months after my rabbinic ordination, a hospital chaplain who knew me called and said, Rabbi, I have a Jewish patient here, and we just decided to bring hospice into his room. And his wife and family are all here, and the patient is still able to talk. We don't know how much time we're going to have left with him, but he requested to meet the rabbi who was going to officiate his funeral. Can you come today? And I had a baby naming that day and then a wedding. And I said, I can get there around 4:30. Do you think he'll still be with us? Like, how imminent is this, right? And the chaplain said, I think he'll still be with us. Please get here. If 4:30 works, great. We'll see you then. And I came, I met the patient and his family. He invited his family out of the room. And this patient said, I really want to share with you so many things. And please, yes, take notes, Rabbi. I would love that. And I want to make sure at my funeral, you say this, 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 and this. And I want you to know my wife, and he went on and on. So at his funeral, it was a completely different experience than I've ever had before. And thankfully, I've had it many times since because of all the networking I'm doing to get the word out that you don't need to belong to my congregation or any congregation. As long as you know about Rabbi Nancy, your personal rabbi, right, who will come and be there and be that presence of compassion for the person and the person's family. And be able at the funeral to provide even additional comfort. I learned after the funeral, the family and people who were there said, wow, that was so touching that Mark was able to tell you all these things, and you didn't really know him, you only met with him that one time, but it was such a different experience than my typical, I never had the privilege to meet Mark. But in learning and meeting with his family, I would like to share with you some of their memories. It's a very different experience for everyone.
We have to kind of end this segment now, but I wonder, is there something, what do you want people to know most about you, and what you can do to help them?
I want people to know most about me is that you're not alone, and I'm here for you. I can be reached 24/7. Most people don't take advantage of that, which is, I get my sleep, that's good. But I have a huge heart, and I truly care about, especially those who feel so alone, that I'm able to lend the support. And I have a unique toolbox with my social work, cantorial, rabbinic, chaplain training, that I can provide compassion, even if you don't want to belong to any congregation, including my congregation. That's okay. It's okay. You're a human being, and you have needs, and I'm here for you.
Thank you. That's beautiful, and that's just the kind of statement I guess I was looking for. And again, I think that being born Jewish, I can't speak for everyone, but for myself, it's something that you never lose, and it's always a part of you. And even though I'm not connected to a congregation, I feel I'm absolutely connected to the religion and to the culture of the religion.
Sure. So. Well, may you be blessed as you go on your way. Thank you so much for having me,
Thank you. That was
and many
lovely
blessings to
meeting
you. Stay healthy, stay safe, and be well.
and you too.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
When I first met Rabbi Nancy, I couldn't help thinking of someone else that I had met recently at a networking group, and that is Marguerite O'Connor, who is the goodwill ambassador for the Chicago Jewish funerals. And of course, as it turned out, Rabbi Nancy and Marguerite have often run into each other in the course of practicing their professions. Uh, Marguerite has a very interesting background, which I'm going to ask her to share with us. But first, I'd like her to tell you a little bit about Chicago Jewish funerals. Obviously, this is a time when they're very busy, unfortunately, and the way they practice their business has changed considerably because of COVID, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have her on. Hi, Marguerite. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Wendy, for inviting me. It's great to be here with you and your audience.
I want to ask you first, what does a goodwill ambassador do?
I basically do community relations. Chicago Jewish Funerals was founded by David Jacobson, who has always been very active in our community. And I end up going to a lot of chamber meetings. We're members of 4 chambers. You can look on our website and see the many different organizations that Chicago Jewish Funerals does support. So basically, it's community outreach and building trusted relationships.
Well, that's certainly important for any business, but I would think especially for the funeral business and anything involved in, that terrible time in people's lives when they're going through tragedy. Um, I noticed I was on the website for the Chicago Jewish funerals, and I noticed that the number of people that can be actually on site at a funeral is 25. Is that right? Is that the
That is currently correct. And my disclaimer there is just that I would encourage people to check the website because we stay abreast of the changing guidelines. And so when the program airs or when some of your listeners hear it, it might be different by then. So again, I do encourage you to always check the funeral home website for the current updates.
that's a really good point, and I think it's something we all have to keep in mind because there is a concerted effort on the part of federal and state and everybody else to get people back to quote unquote normal. Uh, and they go sort of back and forth depending on what's happening with the virus.
Right. And
Obviously.
in Jewish services, many of our services were at the graveside, but we do have services in the chapel again, and we do currently have masks and gloves and sanitizer available to people paying their respects at the funeral home. So those are things that we're doing again as part of a community service to keep people safe.
And I know that you're doing a lot of Zooming, isn't that correct? So that people can attend really from, in one way, I think it's a plus because people that might not be able to come in for a funeral for a loved one, because of the distance, now can
That's a great point,
participate.
Wendy. Absolutely. And Chicago Jewish Funerals was on board with videotaping services prior to the pandemic. So we were ready to pivot, a major word that we all used last year. And so we were able to record graveside services if the family wishes. We also have the technology in the chapels. And you can again go to our website and see some of the services that have taken place. And it's not the same as being in person. We recognize the importance of the ritual and the support. So I'm not minimizing the pain, but I will say, dovetailing what you just said, that we've heard from people who maybe had a hip replacement and were uneasy about walking on cemetery grounds. They were able to feel like they participated in watching the service from the comfort, in some cases, of their car or from their home. And they can also go back and revisit the service. And also, to your point, it was sometimes financially or physically difficult for people to come in from out of town or out of the country. And we are hearing from families we serve that even though, as one of our networking friends says, we're in a contracted period of time in some ways, but we've also expanded in some ways. So we do have family members visiting from around the country, outside of the country, and that is definitely a plus for a convenience culture.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think it's a plus for all of us in several ways. And uh, I'm really anticipating a lot of these. I don't know whether to call them rituals exactly, if Zoom a ritual, but I think they are things that we're going to continue using in ways we haven't before, just because they're so convenient, and our lives are going to remain restricted for a certain period of time. I don't know how we can avoid it.
Right. And we are a geographically dispersed culture, so it is not uncommon for family members to have close relatives that live out of town, or as I said, out of the country. And even while people are grieving, it's a wonderful technology that we can actually see the person, but it's still important to phone people, to send cards, to check on your loved ones, to keep in touch, to really balance the isolation and some socialization.
It just occurred to me. I wonder if Hallmark is doing more of a business now than they've done before. Because greeting cards, are becoming more and more unusual. People just Christmas cards alone. Remember, you used to get tons and tons of Christmas cards. Now you can kind of count them, on a couple of hands, and that's it. And they're just from very close people. But I'm thinking that maybe they have become more popular simply because people want to reach out to another person, and you can't. You just
Right. I have an uncle in assisted living, and while they were under, sort of a lockdown, I mean, we did what we could. We would still visit him when we could in person,
yeah.
and then we moved to window visits. And so someone like that who is in assisted living, for example, greeting cards are very important for them. It's still a connection to the outside world. It reminds them that they're not forgotten, that people are thinking of them. And there are all kinds of greeting cards if someone has a serious or a terminally ill diagnosis. It may not be a get well card, but it may be more just a thinking of you type of card. All of that is very important. And I hear a lot from people who've been in the hospital or who had a loss. And right now, we're talking about many kinds of losses, death being a primary loss. But many people have had a loss of health, loss of income, loss of a job, sometimes feeling food insecurity. All of these are losses.
Yeah. And it comes at the very time when you most want to hug someone and be hugged in return, then you can't.
Right. So to that point, we are doing more memorial services than we would traditionally have done. So we traditionally would have chapel services and graveside services with Chicago Jewish funerals. But we realized that people felt the need for that physical support, the hugs, the people being in the room to tell their stories, and to provide comfort to the mourners. So this is one change again, as a result of the pandemic, that we will see more memorial services.
Tell me something. I know I've been to some funerals where people have become very overwrought and had some bad reaction. Does that happen? And if it does, what is your reaction and what?
So we do have some terms that I learned in mortuary school. So when I was working as a traditional funeral director, and I also taught for 8 years at the mortuary school. So one of the terms was bereavement overload, and that is essentially too much too soon in the way of grief. So we have had some families that lost more than one family member,
Okay.
and that can complicate the grief because you don't have the time to sort of navigate or recover, if you will, or reconcile your first loss before you have another loss. We've also seen some younger people die, and parents do not expect their children to precede them in death, but sometimes that happens. And the fact that people could not physically be at the hospital sometimes when their loved one was critically ill or dying, although many places do offer compassionate care, so they do allow the family in prior to the death. But yes, these are things that can really complicate the grief or compound the grief.
What did you do before that prepared you to do that? And you mentioned that you were at the school that you did
Yes, I
classes.
taught at the mortuary college. So I am a first generation person who had gone to mortuary school in my family. So I did not, have family in the business. And I worked for decades as a traditional funeral director and embalmer, and 8 years as a mortuary college instructor. And then I also did co-author a book called Grief Struck to help people cope with grief. And my co-author and I donated copies to the library, and people can still get the book at their local bookstore. We published through self-published through Author House. But once again, this was sort of my path. When I reflect back, my dad had died at a very young age. My mother was widowed at age 34 with 4 children under the age of 6. And so death, was something that was just part of our family's DNA, and we navigated the best we could. But I always had this curiosity. And then after going to mortuary school, and that is where my path would cross with David Jacobson and other funeral directors, because I did serve on various professional committees and boards, and was just all in with serving families. But currently I am not working as a funeral director because I am the goodwill ambassador for the funeral home, and so that evolved very naturally for me, and I'm very, very proud to work with the professional team of funeral directors and our other administrative staff at Chicago Jewish Funerals.
Is that post a usual thing for funeral homes?
I think it is somewhat unique to our funeral home, but other funeral homes may, call it community relations or have other names for the additional help that they have. And people will sometimes say to me, again, how is it that you're not of the Jewish faith or culture and you're working with Chicago Jewish Funerals? But as I said, David has always been progressive. When I was teaching, he was one of the funeral directors that hired women. And I went to mortuary school when our class was only 10% female. So women have always worked in funeral service, but sometimes more in the background, in bookkeeping, hairdressing, things of that nature. And so it was great that David, was always open to taking any student who was coachable, and he would allow them to serve apprenticeships, which was required in the state of Illinois. So after the students graduated from mortuary college, they still were required to serve an apprenticeship. So David definitely has been a leader in the profession.
And I do want to ask you a little bit more about the book that you wrote. First, how did you come to write it?
So the answer to that is that because I was very passionate and hardworking as a first generation funeral director, I would meet people from hospice and again have different professional associations. And one day someone said to me, "You seem very passionate about, advanced funeral planning and your work in funeral service. And I know someone who's also passionate, but this person is a counselor in hospice. I think you two should meet." And the rest is history, as they say. I ended up meeting Marianne Green. She is the co-author of Grief Struck, When a Death Changes Your Life. And it was really a very interesting opportunity to self-publish and to have 2 different voices. So we came to this with passion about our work, but also different experiences and stories to tell.
And with that, I'm going to close up shop here. First, I want to thank my guest, Marguerite, and also Rabbi Nancy for coming and joining us. And I hope that you've found this as helpful as I have. And also, obviously, I want to thank our audience, too. And I hope you'll come back again next week. It's Monday at noon at 216thenet.com. And we're also on Facebook. You can see this show as a video on Succeed in a Pandemic on Facebook. So I hope you'll do that. And please share it and maybe like it so we can find out how we're doing. With that, I'm going to say goodbye. And I hope, as I said, you'll join us next week. And until then, that you'll stay in and stay well. Thank you. And thank you again.